Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the movie Spring. Spring is a horror story that's light on horror and incredibly strong on story. It's horror done in a very conversational, improv-y, almost like Richard Linklater-like tone. Now, I haven't actually seen any of the before films, but I know Richard Linklater's style very well, and I can feel it throughout this movie. Having these two people fall in love throughout it with a bit of a horror backdrop. This is almost an extreme version of kind of art horror or art movie horror in a way that really loves its characters and loves a good love story and lets that envelop you. It plays more like a foreign love story than really a horror movie, and that's kind of what's so intoxicating about it and what's so interesting about it. Is Spring has a more conversational view on storytelling, makes it more of an interesting horror film that someone would want to tackle a movie like this in the way it does. And because of that, it makes it more of a rich story. It reminds me of rich stories like The Twilight Zone or a great horror short story that you hear and it really haunts you, not just because of the scary elements, but because of the fine storytelling and craftsmanship. A young man named Evan, who after college came back home to take care of his sick mother. She dies, and then after her funeral, he gets in a fight at a bar where he beats up somebody and the cops are looking for him, so he impulsively decides to leave town and decides to go to Italy, and there he does, and he meets some English guys, and they drive to this small seaside town where he sees a beautiful woman and instantly falls in love with her and won't just sleep with her. He wants to actually have a romance, and they do start falling in love. Of course, she has a terrible, horrific secret, but he doesn't care as he keeps falling in love with her, and she hopes her transformations don't get any worse as their romance keeps blooming. There has been a lot of horror films recently on smaller scale that are respectful of the genre, are interested in the storytelling capabilities of horror, but they want to put it in a different mode. The kind of conversational way we're going about horror films like this and Only Lovers Left Alive, where you're really almost showing what it would be like to exist with something like this. It's not trying to emphasize the supernatural. It's not trying to emphasize the horrific elements. It kind of makes you exist in it more. It makes you think about it more. It makes it more relatable. And Spring is very good at that. A love story film that's also a real hauntingly good story. That's the best thing about these kind of new horror films. And I've talked about this in so many different reviews. I feel like horror's really coming alive this year with a lot of directors who really want to do interesting things with it, but they also end up making like really good horror movies, and Spring's definitely one of those. But the multiplex, it feels really boring. Everyone refers to the horror movie of the week as like a junky horror movie, and no one's really respecting them, because why would you respect them? There's nothing to be respected. It's interesting how these smaller films have kind of taken on the genre and really making it their own and making it a lot more exciting than really the studios are doing. I hope it really leads to something, even if this is just a year or two of interesting projects. I'm kind of happy with that. Spring is just another one that emphasizes what you can really do with a particular genre and how you can both respect the genre but put it in a different kind of a film. Now, there's a lot about Spring I don't want to talk about, even do a spoiler section, because part of it is kind of the reveal of what happens in it, and I didn't really reveal what you will know later on and the things she turns into and things. That's part of the fun of Spring, is not knowing. The film would be good without it, but it definitely a neat surprise, and I don't really want to ruin it. That's interesting for a film the way this film is made, because you really wouldn't see that for a film like this, but it actually wears it very well. It's clear that a lot of directors were raised on both kind of art films and horror films, and seeing those kind of merge together in really interesting ways. Spring reminds me of the fine craftsmanship of someone like Rod Serling. A lot of people compare it to Lovecraft. I'm not as familiar with Lovecraft as I am with Serling, but the thing about why I bring up The Twilight Zone or fine horror storytelling or science fiction storytelling, when that started, and I think it's harder to view now because we've gone through like 30-40 years of big budget sci-fi horror, is that you used to have to make an impression, because that's kind of all you really had. You had to just tell a good story, and that's what got people into it. That's what makes you love that particular genre. And Spring is more about that. It's more about understanding these characters. When Evan comes to Italy and is in this town, he just becomes a farmer for room and board and with this guy, and you wouldn't see that in a horror film. You wouldn't see that attention to character. And once the spooky elements come in, a lot of them, if they have a strong emphasis on character and have a lot of character development and give you time to understand the characters, drop it because they know what the audience wants and that's what they have to give to them. Like The Lazarus Effect is a film I saw recently that does that in its third act. And Spring almost takes the first act where it should naturally go and understand the character and doesn't drop that. Kind of like you took the first act of a horror film where everyone's hanging out and getting to know each other and made a whole film with that kind of vibe. It almost did it with the Richard Linklater thing. That's the thing I really love about Spring, because I love those parts in any good horror movie where you get to know the character as much as the scary parts. When you have a finely crafted horror film that can really turn it up to 11 at a certain moment, and it can be amazing, but at certain times you have films that turn it up to 11 because they have to go there. And I almost get sick of the genre's need to do that. And horror is very traditional a lot of times in terms of like what they feel the audience should want. And Spring kind of doesn't care about that. It just wants to show you this sweet love story. I've read it's one of the sweetest body horror films you'll ever see. And I think that's really true. It's like a sweet movie with a lot of horrific ideas behind it. There is some forebodingness, but not as much as you expect from a horror movie. And I love that about Spring, because the cool thing about any genre is when someone comes in and plays around in it. And we're having that a lot with horror, and I don't know if that's because the found footage is gone and people are looking for the new thing, or that people just were raised on these things so they want to play around more. But Spring really feels like an interesting way to do it, and it makes it richer because it cares more about the story itself than adhering to a genre. I like genre pieces, but often with horror it feels like it has to go into that genre. And I think when a horror movie decides like, I don't know, what would be best for these characters? What would be best for this kind of a story? And I think Spring inhabits that so well. Spring gets the kind of film its characters deserve. And I think there's a lot of horror films that don't understand that. Like so many of these really good small horror films, Spring makes you believe in horror again and makes you believe in the possibilities of it. That there's kind of like this smaller art house horror genre really going on right now, and having interesting things and more alive film going experiences to behold in it. It gets why we still talk about the Twilight Zone and why we talk about Rossellini movies and mixes them all together to make an interesting love story of a character piece with a horror story. Spring's the kind of horror film that will stay with you because of the story element to it. Not necessarily, it's not scary whatsoever. It's the kind of horror story that will stick with you. When I think of a good horror story, I think of what happened within it. And it's going to be really hard to forget about a film that's as rich, inviting, and conversational as Spring really is. So if you have seen Spring and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.